Zoroastrianism as a religion has been, for most of its history, an oral one. However, it has become, recently in the grand scheme of things, a religion of the book. But not just one book, multiple smaller books. So in this episode, we will be exploring the Zoroastrian literary canon, including the books of the Avesta, theological, mythological, and other texts dating from the Middle Persian period onwards to the modern day. We'll also be discussing Persian mythology with Dr. Firuza Melville, one of the experts from the Shahnameh Center at the University of Cambridge. To learn more about some of the topics that we discuss in this episode, check out our other entries here on our series, because we are Zoroastrianism 101, a series that explores the histories, theologies, mythologies, and more of one of the oldest continuously practiced religions. So join us now for our 5th episode of Zoroastrianism 101. Every religion with important texts has differing notions of how to classify scripture. What's canon, what's most important, what's sacred, what's outdated, what's divinely inspired, and so on. These very debates rage on across religions, especially in Zoroastrianism. Within the faith on a popular scale, there's no special categorization for scriptural works, but for the sake of this video, we'll be dividing Zoroastrian literature into liturgical, wisdom, and mythological texts. As such, let's start with liturgical texts. While the debates, as mentioned earlier, rage as to what is what, Zoroastrians at least agree on the importance of the Avesta, a collection of liturgical texts compiled over centuries, all composed either in Old Avestan, the language of Zarathustra, or Young Avestan, a later derivative of the language. This is known as a liturgical language, meaning it's primarily used not in everyday conversation, but rather in liturgy, prayer, and sacred literature. In fact, all that we know as the Avestan language is within the covers of the Avesta, and unlike something like Catholic Latin, no new words are added into the language. The Avesta is claimed to have consisted of 21 masks, or books, paralleling the 21 words of the most sacred Avestan prayer, the Ahunavaria. However, there is no definitive evidence of this besides mentions in secondary texts, and any such evidence is said to have been destroyed during the conquest of Alexander the Great and the subsequent fall of the Achaemenid religious institutions. The supposed remaining texts were preserved, recompiled, and standardized beginning in the Parthian era and continued in the Sasanian period. However, the oldest surviving fragment of the Avesta that we have, after the fall of the 3 great empires, only dates from 1323 CE. It's interesting to note that some Zoroastrians view the entire Avesta as having been composed by Zarathustra through either divine inspiration or by being provided the literal text itself, including the later Zend commentary by Ahura Mazda. A few Zoroastrians reject most of the Avesta, favoring only the Gathas, while most Zoroastrians view the Avesta as spiritually imbued, but not fully divinely inspired. Scripturalization and canonization are complex matters in any religion, and Zoroastrianism is no different. So, what are the books of the Avesta? The Yasna. This is the core liturgical text of Zoroastrianism, and is generally considered the most important book in the Avesta. It includes hymns, ritual instructions, and invocations used in the Yasna ceremony, which for thousands of years was the central act of worship in the religion, involving the sacred fire and the Haoma offering, amongst other ritual elements. Within the Yasna lie the Gathas, the oldest and most revered hymns attributed directly to Zarathustra. These Gathas, composed in Old Avestan, form the scriptural heart of the religion, expressing Zarathustra's vision and teachings, and are held by nearly all Zoroastrians as the unifying central scripture of the faith. The Yasna Haptangaiti is included within the Gathas and is considered the original liturgy of the first Zoroastrian community. And finally, the 4 sacred mantras are also present, bookending the Gathas. These mantras, the Gathas and the Yasna Haptangaiti, are the only texts in the religion to be composed in Old Avestan. The Visperad. Often seen as a liturgical extension of the Yasna, the Visperad includes additional invocations and supplements for use in more elaborate rituals, such as seasonal festivals. The term Visperad means prayer to all the lords, referring to the divine beings honored in these ceremonies. The Vendidad. A more controversial text, the Vendidad is the youngest of all the Avestan texts and consists of a priestly code of laws which concern subjects such as ritual purity, funerary practices, corporeal punishments, cosmological myths, and spiritual medicine. The Vendidad primarily deals with the boundaries between the sacred and the profane, and prescribes penalties for various moral and ritual offenses. It reflects a growing concern with legalism and orthopraxy, likely shaped during later periods of Zoroastrian institutional reorganization, such as in the Sasanian era. It is the most debated of the Avestan texts, with large portions of modern Zoroastrianism outright rejecting it as part of the Avestan canon, with even respected Dasturs, high priests of Zoroastrianism, calling it either a later or pre-Zoroastrian text that is not on the same level as the rest of the Avesta. The Yash. These are a collection of 21 holy hymns praising individual divinities, Yazatas, such as Mithra, Anahita, and Tistriya. The Yash are generally considered evidence of the continuation of the Mazdayasni religion before Zarathustra, but it should be noted that there is no recorded evidence of these divinities before Zarathustra. The Yash are poetic, mythic, and often narrative, preserving legends and heroic lore reflecting popular devotion and cosmological drama. Many Zoroastrians consider the Yash to be powerful prayer formulas, which can aid in enlightenment, healing, and other metaphysical blessings bestowed by the Yazatas invoked. The Corde Avesta. Literally meaning the Little Avesta, this is a compilation of daily prayers and shorter liturgical texts, including the Niyayeshes, prayers to the elements, Gaz, prayers for the 5 periods of the day, and Zirosa, a calendar of divine beings honored throughout the month. These texts are designed for lay devotional use and reflect the lived piety of Zoroastrian practitioners. The Corde Avesta is not usually included in the Avesta. Still, it is treated with the same reverence by many, and thus achieves a status similar to the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. Of note is that the Corde Avesta can sometimes be written in a mix of languages, including both forms of Avestan, Pazand, Middle Persian, Gujarati, and other languages that were and are relevant to the time and place in which it was produced. Beyond these, other liturgical texts, old and new, can differ from community to community. Along with this, some are no longer in use, some are used only by specific groups, such as the priesthood, and some are unwritten. While we won't go into them in this 101, we should note that some liturgical texts are presented with marginal commentary called Zend that interprets passages, recommends liturgical movements, and more. The practice of Zend does not seem to continue, but the Zend of ancient scholars of the faith is still taken into consideration. Thus, when you see the term Zend Avesta, it means the Avesta with the commentary. Our next category of Zoroastrian texts, wisdom literature, comprises teachings of sages and compendia of knowledge that have been considered important by Zoroastrians. Wisdom literature is not unique to Zoroastrianism and predates Zarathustra around the world, with some of the earliest texts in this genre dating back to the 3rd millennium BCE. We won't have time to explore all of the Zoroastrian wisdom literature out there, partially because it is still being produced. Still, we will explore some notable types of wisdom literature to provide an overview. Councils. These texts, also called andars, which literally means counsels, are guides for living a righteous life that are akin to modern self-help books and consist of the sayings and teachings of virtuous Zoroastrians. The most well-known of these is the counsels and sayings of Adurbadi Maraspand, an influential high priest during the reign of Shapur I in the 4th century CE. He is most well known for having survived unharmed an ordeal where molten metal was poured on his chest to prove his piety and his mythological Pishdadian ancestry. His counsels and sayings, dedicated to his son, with some spoken to the people on his deathbed, remain popular guides for ethical living amongst Zoroastrians, providing advice on everything from politics to spirituality. Adurbadi Maraspan's sayings vacillate between timeless relevance and, at times, being terribly outdated. As with all texts, it is up to the individual Zoroastrian's power of choice to decide what still applies and what no longer does. While Adurbadi Maraspan's sayings are reminiscent of motivational posts seen on social media, some counsels are more catechismic and thus are stricter guides towards what to believe and what to avoid. The Shidag Andars I Poryodskeshan, the select counsels of the sages, is a notable example, reflecting the important beliefs and practices of the faith during a set era of its history, likely the early Middle Persian era. Dr. R.C. Zaner, the late Spalding professor of Eastern religion and ethics at Oxford University, considered the text to sum up succinctly the whole of the Zoroastrian doctrine at the time that it was produced. With 58 dictums of what the text's authors considered orthodox Zoroastrian belief, the select counsel of the sages remains strictly catechismic to some Zoroastrians and a point of his spiritual historical study to others. While differing at times in audience and content, all counsel texts, these and others, are unified by the scaffolding of providing spiritual advice and knowledge in accessible ways. Their purpose is to apply this knowledge to one's life, and community as well, to encourage spiritual development further, but not necessarily to view their teachings as infallibly sacred. Questions and answers. Modeling a style of theological engagement found in the Avesta, these texts are a back and forth of questions and answers, usually submitted by a person or a community. They are then answered by either a learned community of theologians or by a specific person considered pious and educated enough to answer the questions at hand. The most extensive subcategory of these texts are the rivayats, a word with unknown etymology. It is here that this question-answer format is most prominently seen. The oldest example of these is the Rivayat of Ardur Farnbag from the 9th century CE, which provided short and succinct answers to 147 questions, an impressive feat to us in modern times, who can barely muster up the willpower to answer an email. The most important of these Rivayats, however, are the massive Persian Rivayats, the only modern Persian texts written in the Avestan script. Dating from between the 15th and 18th centuries CE, with answers to over 500 questions. They are so core to modern Zoroastrianism that they are often just simply called the Rivayats. It is a vast collection of correspondences between Parsi and Iranian Zoroastrians, in which the Parsis asked many questions of their co-religionists who were viewed as being more educated in spiritual matters. These answers are usually divided by content and further by the exact theologian that answered the question, thus providing them with what Dr. Sir Ervad Jivanji Jamshedji Modi, the legendary 19th and 20th century Shams-ul-Ulama of the Parsi Zoroastrian community, described as a similar quality and importance to Jewish texts where rabbis answer questions from believers. The Rivayats deal with everything from conversion to dream interpretation, and so much more, leading to them to still be consulted and debated for modern issues of various types. Some groups within Zoroastrianism exchange further correspondences, such as followers of the Kadmi calendar, who compiled the Rivayat-e-Haftad Vahast, the Rivayat of 78 questions, which they added to the original Rivayat canon. These question and answer texts, amongst others, have a timeless importance attached to them, in which they become a way for Zoroastrians to consult with religious scholars throughout time, in dealing with whatever issues may fascinate the community at any given moment. While viewed as interpretations without the sheer authority of, say, the words of Zarathustra and the Gathas, they are nonetheless crucial towards understanding how Zoroastrians felt in the past about certain matters and why. Apologia. A popular genre throughout various religions, Zoroastrians are also inclined towards apologia. These texts undertook the task of defending the faith as understood by a particular theologian against the viewpoints of other religions, and sometimes even emergent and innovative theologies and practices within the faith. The Shikan Gumanig Vizar, the doubt-dispelling exposition, is the Zoroastrian text bar none that best shows Zoroastrian apologia in action against neighboring faiths, their beliefs, and their traditions. Written by Mardan Farooq, a mysterious Zoroastrian theologian and philosopher, it was composed in direct response to the plight of Zoroastrians after the Muslim conquest of Persia, and likely in the 8th century CE. The book analyzes and critiques the theologies of Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and Manichaeism, by also comparing them to Zoroastrian beliefs and practices, while also clarifying what the author viewed as incorrect assumptions about Zoroastrianism by these religions. This text was produced at a time when Zoroastrians were being converted to other faiths by choice and by force, and thus acted as a way, as the title says, to dispel doubt in the faith and its doctrines. However, as mentioned, Zoroastrianism's apologetics are not just limited to debating other faiths and their theologies, but also include the questioning and defense of positions within the faith. In the 21st century, Dr. Kirsi Antia's The Argument for Acceptance in Zoroastrianism is a popularly circulated text that acts as apologia for conversion into Zoroastrianism. In this text, Dr. Antia, a noted Parsi Zoroastrian priest and scholar, defends converts against those arguing for a closed and ethnic religion. Its importance in modern Zoroastrianism is further cemented by its inclusion on the popular info site Avesta.org, which is operated by noted Zoroastrian convert Joseph Peterson, who Dr. Antia had a personal hand in converting to the faith. These texts, if anything, show Zoroastrianism's long and storied history of debate to defend and criticize positions during points of controversy and theological anxiety. While other categories of texts sit on the shelves of history, apologia continues to be one of the most dynamic and published forms of Zoroastrian literature and will no doubt continue to be in the future. Compendiums. Theological compendia are such a normative part of Zoroastrianism that the Avesta was described, before its current form, as a veritable encyclopedia encompassing matters beyond theology and cosmology, and into the legal and scientific matters of its time. In fact, we get the majority of our knowledge of the Avesta in this form from the most influential Zoroastrian compendiums, the Denkard, Acts of Religion. Dating from the 10th century CE, and likely the work of multiple authors, the Denkard once consisted of 9 books, but the first 2.5 books have been lost to the ravages of time. Considered to be the preeminent encyclopedia of the faith, as it was in the 10th century CE, it includes a bit from every other category of literature so far discussed in this episode. It answers questions on drunkenness, collects the teachings of sages, analyzes the contents of the Avesta, and much more. It is not merely an introduction like this video series and goes rather deep into some of its topics, making it a valuable resource to peek back at what was considered important enough to compile in a text like this. alongside the Denkard, the possibly late Sasanian Buddha-Hashin, primal creation, a name applied to it in later times, is a cosmological compendium still referenced by Zoroastrians. It provides the reader with a massive and varied collection of mythological and astrological insights. It discusses impossibly tall holy mountains, why poison exists, and even how eventually mortals will be able to survive without food. As unfolding conceptions of Zoroastrian cosmology and mythos have developed throughout the centuries, the Buddha-Hashin is not as important as it once was, but is nonetheless studied and reinterpreted, thus a part of the constant cycle of renewal that Zoroastrian texts undergo, where they are put in the context of their times and thus re-evaluated for new eras of the faith. While no notable modern Zoroastrian text could be adequately described as a compendium, the Encyclopedia Iranica is a trove of prime academic research into anything Iranic, now edited by Dr. Turaj Darye. Adherents treat it as a treasure trove in their own studies and spiritual development, thus showing that even these important compendiums do not need to come from Zoroastrians, and that in today's iteration of the faith, academic accuracy is held in the highest regard. Mythological literature. No religion is complete without the beautiful human propensity to develop stories and poetry that detail the events of our imaginal past and to describe the wonders of the realms beyond the visible world. Within Zoroastrianism, some of these read like travel journals, such as the 16th century Kisai Sanjan, the Story of Sanjan, which purports to detail the origins of the Parsi community in India after fleeing Persia, and has become the central foundational story of the Parsi community and their origins. It is treated unquestionably by many members of the Parsi community, and is even used in theological discussions on matters as varied as conversion and intermarriage in India. The undateable Zandi Vaman Yazn, commentaries on the Vohumana Yasht, unrelated to any actual Yasht despite its name, details a mythological sequence in which Zarathustra is provided with a prophetic look into the future by Ahura Mazda himself. It warns of great calamities and hearkens the coming of great heroes that will save Zoroastrianism. Thus, it displays a Zarathustra of exceptional abilities, as seen in previous episodes, which is also explored within the mythological telling of his life, the 13th century Shahnameh, the Book of Zarathustra, and keeps the strong tradition of the Super Zarathustra alive. However, no mythological text is more important to Zoroastrians than one written actually by the most revered non-Zoroastrian in the faith's history, the 11th century Shahnameh, composed by the Iranian master poet Ferdowsi. To learn more about it, let's actually turn now to Dr. Firuza Melville of the Shahnameh Center at the University of Cambridge.
I would imagine that it would take us the whole life to discuss the idea what the Shahnameh is, and especially nowadays, and during the whole millennium of its life after its creation. And I imagine that you're asking about the Shahnameh written, versified, and compiled by Abul Qasim Ferdowsi in the 11th century. But of course, before him and after him, there have been produced quite a few Shahnamehs. And for example, in Ottoman Turkey, there is the whole genre called Shahnameh. But if we talk about that particular Shahnameh, first of all, its meaning, it could be translated not only as the Book of Kings, Shahnameh, but also the King of Books, because it is not only the longest ever written poem in the whole history of humankind by a single author, and we all know that it's so long that it could be compared with the Iliad and Odyssey put together, and it will be still twice as long. And we know at least one of his predecessors, he was called Abu Mansur Daqiqi. He was a court poet. That Ferdowsi was in a very privileged position because he was not a court poet. He didn't have to serve at the court to earn his living. He could afford to spend all his time collecting the necessary materials, everything he could find, and it was the written sources, they were the oral folk materials, everything he could find. Before the Kiki, of course, which was already in the 10th century, we had, they had quite a lot of sources, and one of them was, of course, the Hwataj Namak, which could be translated as, again, the Book of Kings or the Book of Lords, and that was compiled during the Sasanian times. Unfortunately, that source never survived, and we're very grateful to him, to the Hiki, to all his contemporaries, and of course the patrons who encouraged them to produce such a piece, which is absolutely phenomenal, and it's impossible to overestimate its influence and importance. So we have 50 reigns of the Iranian kings, starting from the creation of the world. And that is why probably it could be compared with the importance of the Bible in the Christian world, because it helped preserve the beauty and the treasure of the Persian language and culture. The Kiki was a court poet compared with Ferdowsi. He started to write his Shahnameh. We don't have the whole poem. My theory is that it could be that the Kiki wrote much more than 1,000 baits, 1,000 double verses, which Ferdowsi incorporated into his Shahnameh. Probably the reason for that was that he wanted to save what was written by his predecessor. On the other hand, it was quite dangerous for Ferdowsi because the Kiki had quite a tragic end. We know that he was murdered by his slave. It was probably a political murder because the Kiki openly declared himself as Zoroastrian. What Ferdowsi did, he incorporated into his Shahnameh that episode, but this episode describes the emergence of Zoroastrianism. So he decided to remove the responsibility for describing this very ambiguous episode in the history of the Iranian nation, and say, oh, this is not me, this is the Kiki, this is all history. The historical part, which starts more or less from the conquest of Alexander the Great, Iskandar, who in the Shahnameh is already part of the Iranian history. But it is actually more important what is happening before. The heroic cycle with the great hero of Rustam, who is the savior of the nation. We have, this is the period of the Khanid dynasty, which is legendary. And this is where we have the Zoroastrian sources, which are very closely related to the characters of these kings. Because the first king and the first human in Ferdowsi's version is Kiyomaz, which would mean Kayo Morta, someone who is mortal but still alive, which is paradoxical. And then we have someone called Jamshid, Yema. Of course, it's a very close connection with the Sanskrit literary and religious tradition. Again, we have this root Morta, who is mortal compared with gods. And we've got Yema or Jamshid. And Jamshid is a very colorful and three-dimensional character. He became too proud of all his achievements. And of course, as a result, he thought that he was given this right by God, and he is more or less a semi-god himself, and he was severely punished for that. One of the best translations of the Shahnameh into English has been made by Dick Davis, who is a poet in his own right. He has a very interesting foreword written by his wife, by his Iranian wife. She's called Azarna, and in her introduction she mentioned that for us Iranians, the characters of the Shahnameh, they're more or less like the members of our family, despite the fact that they were portrayed 1,000 years ago by Ferdowsi, or probably they never existed. Nevertheless, they are perceived as the members of the family. And when there is a crisis, when there is a problem, a family problem, people start thinking about the past of the nation, and this helps.
And this is only a small slice of the sheer amount of Zoroastrian literature out there, all on varying levels of sacrality and importance, differing not just from one community to another, but also from individual to individual. Every year, new texts alongside commentaries and translations of older ones are published, making the literary side of Zoroastrianism a living, dynamic, and ongoing expression of the faith. Thank you for joining us for this 5th episode of Zoroastrianism 101. Can you believe we're halfway through the series already? We hope it has been informative, entertaining, and insightful in multiple ways. In the next episode, we'll dive into Zoroastrian theology and metaphysics, where we'll attempt to get quite esoteric without becoming too mind-boggling in the process. Please support our ongoing efforts by donating using the link in the description. See you all next episode.